Welcome back, history enthusiasts. I'm Philip Champion, and this is WW2 Stories. Before we begin today's episode, if you're a fan of World War II stories, would you please follow our show on whatever platform you listen to and leave a comment? We would love to hear from you. Today we're going to witness the first major airborne invasion in military history. A battle that would revolutionize warfare, demonstrate the terrifying power of paratroopers, and teach both sides lessons that would shape the remainder of World War II and beyond. Picture this. It's dawn on May 20th, 1941. The sky above the Greek island of Crete fills with the drone of hundreds of aircraft engines. British, Australian, New Zealand, and Greek soldiers look up from their defensive positions to see an apocalyptic sight. The sky is darkening with parachutes, hundreds of them, then thousands. German paratroopers are descending like a deadly rain across the island's northern coast, targeting the vital airfields at Maleme, Heraklion, and Rethymno. This is no ordinary assault. This is Operation Mercury, the largest airborne invasion ever attempted, a gamble so audacious that even the German High Command has doubts about its success. Never before has an island been invaded primarily from the air. Never before have thousands of elite troops been dropped directly into battle zones with the expectation that they can seize and hold territory without traditional ground support. The Allied defenders have been warned. British intelligence, having cracked the German Enigma code, knows the invasion is coming. They know the targets, they know the method. They have every advantage except one. They don't fully believe what their intelligence is telling them, and they've prepared for the wrong battle. What follows over the next 12 days will be one of the most brutal and consequential battles of World War II. The Germans will suffer such devastating casualties that Adolf Hitler will abandon airborne operations for the rest of the war. The Allies will be forced to evacuate yet another piece of territory, but they'll learn lessons about airborne warfare that will later prove crucial at D-Day. The Royal Navy will pay a terrible price trying to prevent German reinforcements from arriving by sea. And the civilian population of Crete will rise up in spontaneous, furious resistance, armed with farm tools and kitchen knives, fighting trained paratroopers with a courage that will inspire the world and bring down terrible German reprisals. This is the story of the Battle of Crete, where the sky rained soldiers, where farmers fought alongside professional warriors, where intelligence couldn't overcome poor command decisions, and where a new form of warfare was born in blood and fire. It's a story of innovation and miscalculation, of heroism and tragedy, of a battle that neither side fought the way they expected. Before the first paratrooper jumps from his aircraft, before the first shots are fired, we need to understand why this particular island in the Mediterranean became the site of such a revolutionary and costly military operation. The prize worth fighting for. Crete is not just any island. Stretching 160 miles long but rarely more than 35 miles wide, this mountainous Greek island sits like a barrier across the southern Aegean Sea, perfectly positioned to control the eastern Mediterranean. Whoever holds Crete can threaten shipping lanes, launch air attacks on North Africa, protect or threaten the Balkans, and project power across the entire region. In May 1941, the strategic situation in the Mediterranean is precarious for both sides. The Germans have just completed a lightning conquest of Yugoslavia and Greece in April, driving British forces south in yet another humiliating evacuation. The Battle of Greece has cost the British dearly. Thousands of troops killed or captured, massive amounts of equipment abandoned, and another blow to British prestige after the evacuations from Norway and Dunkirk. But unlike in France or Greece, the British still hold Crete. The island's ports and airfields give them a foothold in the region, a base from which the Royal Navy can operate, and a potential launching point for future operations in the Balkans or against Italian possessions in the Dodecanese Islands. For Adolf Hitler, Crete represents both a threat and an opportunity. British bombers operating from Crete's airfields can reach the vital Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, the primary source of fuel for the German war machine. This is intolerable. Moreover, Hitler is planning Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and he cannot leave a British-held island in his rear that might threaten his southern flank. Crete must be taken, Hitler declares in Directive 28, issued on April 25, 1941. The operation will be known as Mercury. It is essential to deny the British the use of Crete as an air base threatening the Romanian oil fields. But there's a problem. The Germans have no realistic way to conduct a conventional amphibious invasion. The Royal Navy dominates the Mediterranean around Crete, and any invasion fleet would be torn apart before reaching the beaches. The British learned this lesson the hard way at Gallipoli in World War I, and the Germans have no intention of repeating that disaster. Enter Generaloberst Kurt Student, commander of the 11th Fliegerkorps, the German Airborne forces. Student has been advocating for a bold new approach to warfare, using paratroopers and glider-borne troops to seize strategic objectives before conventional forces arrive. He's done it successfully on a small scale. Paratroopers captured the Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael in 1940, cracking open Belgium's defenses in just hours. Now Student proposes something far more ambitious, capturing an entire island using primarily airborne forces. Paratroopers and glider troops would seize Crete's airfields on the north coast. Once the airfields were secured, transport aircraft would fly in reinforcements and heavy weapons. The Luftwaffe would provide air cover and suppress Allied defenses. Eventually, once the airfields were fully secured, the German mountain troops, elite Gebirgsjäger, could be flown in to mop up remaining resistance. It's an audacious plan. It's also terrifyingly risky. Paratroopers are vulnerable during their descent, floating targets that can't fight back. They land scattered, often miles from their intended drop zones. They carry only light weapons. If the airfields can't be captured quickly, the entire operation will collapse. Hitler approves the plan anyway. He's impressed by Student's confidence and the Wehrmacht's string of victories using innovative tactics. The invasion of Crete is scheduled for May 15, 1941, then postponed to May 20th to allow more time for preparation. The Germans are about to attempt something no military force has ever done before: conquer an island from the sky. They will learn at terrible cost whether the revolution in warfare they envision is visionary or suicidal. The secret they couldn't use. While the Germans prepared their revolutionary assault, the British possessed an advantage that should have ensured victory. They knew it was coming. At Bletchley Park in England, the cryptographers who had cracked Germany's Enigma code system were reading German military communications almost in real time. These ultra-intercepts provided insights into German planning that Allied commanders in previous wars could only have dreamed of. In early April 1941, ultra-intercepts began revealing German preparations for a major airborne operation in the Mediterranean. By mid-April, intelligence analysts had identified that airborne forces were being assembled in Bulgaria. On April 26th, a Luftwaffe message specifically mentioned Crete for the first time, confirming the target. Throughout May, as the invasion date approached, Ultra continued to provide updates. The British knew that the German plan called for airborne assault first, targeting the airfields at Maleme, Heraklion, and Rethymno. They knew that seaborne reinforcements would only come after airfields were secured. They even knew that the operation had been postponed from May 15th to May 20th. Prime Minister Winston Churchill personally ensured that this intelligence reached General Bernard Freyberg, the New Zealand officer commanding Allied forces on Crete, known as Creforce. Churchill wrote to Freyberg, "It ought to be a fine opportunity for killing the parachute troops. The island must be stubbornly defended. Freiberg received the intelligence, but there was a critical caveat. To protect the ultra-secret, he couldn't tell his subordinate commanders exactly how he knew the invasion was coming or what form it would take. He had to find ways to position his forces without revealing that British intelligence was reading German codes. This secrecy, combined with Freiberg's own assumptions about the German threat, would prove catastrophic. Despite the intelligence clearly indicating that the main assault would come from the air, Freiberg remained convinced that the primary danger was a seaborne invasion. He had served in World War I and had seen the Gallipoli campaign. He believed, reasonably from his perspective, that the Germans wouldn't risk their elite paratroopers without substantial support from the sea. "I am not apprehensive about an air attack," Freiberg told his commanders. "The real danger will come from the sea. The Germans will try to land conventional forces along the coast, and the paratroops will be a diversion or preliminary to the main assault." Based on this assessment, Freiberg positioned significant forces along the beaches to repel the seaborne invasion he expected. This meant fewer troops were available to defend the airfields, the actual critical objectives. Moreover, the troops defending the airfields weren't always in the best positions because Freiberg believed the airfields themselves were secondary targets. The tragedy of Crete was that the Allies had every piece of information they needed to win. They knew when, where, and how the Germans would attack. But a combination of security concerns that prevented full dissemination of intelligence, command assumptions that contradicted the intelligence, and communication problems that prevented subordinate commanders from understanding the true nature of the threat, all conspired to waste this advantage. "We had the knowledge, but we didn't have the understanding," one British intelligence officer later reflected. "We knew what was coming, but we convinced ourselves we knew better that arrogance cost us the battle." The stage was set for a collision between German innovation and Allied conventional thinking, between accurate intelligence and faulty interpretation, between what the codebreakers knew and what the commanders believed. The architect of airborne warfare. The man responsible for planning Operation Mercury was one of the most innovative military thinkers of World War II, General Oberst Kurt Student, the father of German airborne forces. Student was 51 years old in 1941, a career officer who had served in World War I as a pilot. He had been fascinated by the potential of airborne operations since the 1920s and had spent years developing German paratrooper capabilities. He had personally designed training programs, equipment, and tactics for the Fallschirmjäger, the German paratroopers who were considered among the elite forces of the Wehrmacht. "The paratrooper is a new type of soldier," Student told his officers. "He must combine the courage of the infantryman with the daring of the pilot. He must be willing to jump into the unknown, to land in the midst of enemy forces, and to fight his way out with only what he carries with him." Student's paratroopers had proven themselves in combat during the invasion of the Low Countries in 1940. They had captured key bridges in Holland, seized the fortress of Eben-Emael in Belgium, and demonstrated that airborne forces could achieve strategic objectives that conventional troops couldn't reach quickly enough. But those operations had involved hundreds of paratroopers, not thousands. Crete would be different. Student planned to drop approximately 10,000 men onto the island in 2 waves. One in the morning targeting Maleme and Heraklion, another in the afternoon targeting Rethymno. These forces would secure the airfields, allowing transport aircraft to fly in the 5th Gaybergs Division, elite mountain troops commanded by General Julius Ringel. The plan required split-second timing and near-perfect execution. The transport fleet consisted of about 500 Ju-52 transport aircraft and approximately 80 gliders. Each Ju-52 could carry 12 to 13 paratroopers, or about 2 tons of supplies. The gliders carried specialized assault troops and light artillery. Student divided his forces into 3 groups. Group West would assault Maleme Airfield and the nearby town of Kanea, where Allied headquarters was located. Group Center would target Rethymno Airfield in the middle of the island. Group East would seize Heraklion Airfield and port on the eastern end of the island. The battle plan had an elegant simplicity. Overwhelm the defenders at 3 points simultaneously, preventing them from concentrating their forces. Capture at least 1 airfield in the first day. Pour in reinforcements through that airfield. Secure the other objectives. Declare victory. But Student and his staff were under no illusions about the risks. Intelligence indicated that the Allies had approximately 30,000 troops on Crete, a significant force, though the Germans didn't know that many were exhausted evacuees from Greece with limited equipment and poor morale. The defenders would have prepared positions and would be fighting on ground they knew. The paratroopers would be scattered, lightly armed and vulnerable during their descent. We will win or lose this battle in the first 24 hours, Student told his commanders. If we can capture Maleme Airfield intact on the first day, we can fly in enough reinforcements to overwhelm the defenders. If we fail to secure an airfield, we will be isolated, outnumbered, and destroyed. Student's officers nodded grimly. They understood what their commander was saying. This battle would be won by the courage and skill of the individual paratrooper, by the willingness to attack even when outnumbered, by audacity and aggression and luck. On May 19th, Student gathered his commanders for a final briefing. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we will make history," he told them. "We will prove that the sky is no longer a barrier to military operations. We will show the world a new kind of warfare. Some of you will not survive, but those who do will be remembered as the pioneers of a military revolution." The men dispersed to their units. They checked their weapons, packed their parachutes, and tried to sleep despite the nervous anticipation of combat. At dawn, they would board the Ju-52 transports and fly south toward Crete. None of them knew that they were about to participate in both the greatest triumph and the greatest tragedy of German airborne forces. A battle that would demonstrate the effectiveness of paratroopers while simultaneously convincing Hitler to never use them in large-scale operations again. Death from above. At 6 a.m. on May 20, 1941, the first wave of German aircraft took off from airfields across southern Greece. The drone of hundreds of engines filled the air as Ju-52 transports, their distinctive corrugated aluminum skin glinting in the early light, formed up and headed south toward Crete. For the Allied troops on the island, the first warning came at around 7 a.m., a sound unlike anything most of them had ever heard. The sky itself seemed to vibrate with the roar of engines. Then they appeared, formation after formation of bombers and fighters filling the sky from horizon to horizon. "I looked up and I couldn't believe what I was seeing," recalled a New Zealand soldier. "There were so many aircraft that they actually blocked out the sun in some places. The sky was black with them. We knew something terrible was about to happen." The Luftwaffe began with a massive bombing raid. Ju-88 bombers and Bf-109 fighters strafed defensive positions around Maleme, Heraklion, and Rethymno airfields. They targeted anti-aircraft positions, communication centers, and any visible concentrations of troops. The bombardment was intense and terrifying, designed to suppress Allied defenses and create shock before the paratroopers arrived. At 8 a.m., the first gliders appeared over Maleme Airfield. These were DFS-230 gliders, each carrying 10 assault troops and a pilot. They descended in near silence. The defenders could hear only the rush of air over the wings. And crash-landed near their objectives. Troops poured out and immediately attacked defensive positions. Then came the paratroopers. At 8:15 a.m., the first Ju-52 transports appeared over the drop zones. Their cargo doors opened, and suddenly the sky was filling with parachutes, white, blue and camouflage canopies blossoming like deadly flowers, hundreds of them, then thousands. The German paratroopers jumped from 400 feet, much lower than standard to reduce time exposed during descent. But even 400 feet took precious seconds, and during those seconds they were helpless targets. The Allied defenders opened fire with everything they had. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery all targeted the descending paratroopers. The sky, filled with tracers, parachutes collapsed as men were hit. Bodies tumbled from the sky. Paratroopers who reached the ground alive often landed directly in the middle of Allied positions. "It was a slaughter," remembered a British soldier defending near Maleme. "They were dropping right on top of us, and we were shooting them as they came down. I saw men hit while still in their parachutes, dead before they touched the ground. Others landed in our barbed wire or in minefields. The ones who made it down alive were scattered and disorganized. We thought we had them." The German paratroopers faced additional problems beyond enemy fire. Their weapon containers, metal cylinders containing rifles, machine guns, mortars, and ammunition, were dropped separately. This meant paratroopers landed armed only with pistols and grenades. They had to locate their weapon containers before they could properly engage the enemy, and many containers were lost, destroyed, or fell into Allied hands. Major Walter Koch, commanding a glider assault near Maleme, was wounded almost immediately when his glider crash-landed. Major Eugen Meindl, commanding the paratroop assault at Maleme, was shot and severely wounded soon after landing. All across the drop zones, German officers and NCOS were being killed or wounded in the first minutes of battle. By 10 a.m., the situation for the German paratroopers was desperate. At Heraklion, Australian troops had massacred 2 entire companies of paratroopers as they descended. At Rethymno, Greek and Australian forces had trapped the German survivors in a narrow perimeter. At Maleme, the Germans held some ground but hadn't captured the airfield. "We had never experienced anything like it," recalled a German paratrooper who survived the first day. "We expected resistance, but not like this. We were being shot in the air before we could even reach the ground. Those who landed alive were scattered, couldn't find their weapons, and were being hunted by defenders who knew the ground. In the first hours, I thought we had lost, that we would all be killed or captured." Student monitoring reports from his headquarters in Greece was shocked by the casualty figures coming in. Entire battalions had been decimated. Key objectives hadn't been secured. The afternoon wave, scheduled to assault Rethymno and reinforce other areas, would face the same deadly reception. At 4 p.m., the second wave of paratroopers jumped. The reception was just as brutal. At Rethymno, Australian and Greek defenders inflicted terrible casualties, pinning down the survivors and preventing them from capturing the airfield. By nightfall on May 20th, the first day of Operation Mercury had become a disaster for the Germans. An estimated 4,000 paratroopers, over a third of the assault force, were dead, wounded, or missing. No airfield had been captured intact. The scattered surviving German forces were fighting desperately just to stay alive, surrounded by Allied defenders who outnumbered them and held the defensive positions. Kurt Student faced a decision: call off the operation and evacuate what forces he could, or commit everything to one more attempt to capture Maleme Airfield. Gambling that one more push might break through, Student made the bold choice. He would reinforce Maleme with everything available, every surviving paratrooper, every transport aircraft, every fighter and bomber. Maleme would be taken no matter the cost. Because if Maleme fell, the entire operation could still succeed. If it didn't, Operation Mercury would be recorded as one of the greatest military disasters in German history. The Battle for Maleme. Maleme Airfield sits on the northwest coast of Crete, a flat expanse of runway near the mouth of the Tavernidis River. In May 1941, it's the most important piece of real estate on the island. Whoever controls Maleme controls Crete. The airfield is defended primarily by the 22nd New Zealand Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew, with supporting units including artillery and anti-aircraft guns. The New Zealanders hold strong positions around the airfield, including a crucial piece of high ground called Hill 107, which overlooks the runway and dominates the surrounding terrain. The German assault on Maleme on May 20th has been bloody and chaotic. Paratroopers have landed in and around the airfield, but the New Zealanders have fought them to a standstill. By nightfall, the Germans hold some positions west of the airfield and in the riverbed, but the New Zealanders still control the airfield itself and Hill 107. Captain Campbell commands the westernmost company of the 22nd Battalion, the men holding Hill 107. His position has been under continuous attack all day. German paratroopers have infiltrated close to his positions. Communication with battalion headquarters is spotty. Radio equipment has been damaged or destroyed in the fighting. Campbell's men are low on ammunition, exhausted and surrounded by German dead and wounded. That night, the night of May 20th to 21st, Campbell makes a decision that will lose the Battle of Crete. Unable to reach his battalion commander by radio, uncertain of the situation beyond his immediate area, believing his position on Hill 107 is untenable, Campbell orders his men to withdraw to a secondary position. It's a tactical decision made by a company commander with incomplete information in the chaos of battle. It's also catastrophic. When dawn breaks on May 21st, the Germans discover that Hill 107, the key to Maleme, has been abandoned. They immediately occupy it and begin using it to bring fire down on the airfield and surrounding positions. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew, the battalion commander, is unaware that Campbell has withdrawn until morning. When he learns of it, he immediately orders a counterattack to retake Hill 107. But by then the Germans have reinforced the position, and the counterattack fails with heavy losses. More critically, student monitoring the battle from Greece recognizes that the occupation of Hill 107 gives him an opportunity. He orders his remaining transport aircraft to attempt landings at Maleme despite the fact that the airfield is still under fire. If he can get even a few planes down, he can begin flying in reinforcements. At 4 p.m. on May 21st, the first Ju-52 attempts a landing at Maleme. It's under heavy fire from Allied positions. Some transport aircraft are hit and crash. Others land successfully, disgorge their troops, mountain infantry with heavy weapons, and attempt to take off again. Many don't make it, destroyed on the ground or shot down during takeoff. But enough get through. By nightfall on May 21st, the Germans have landed elements of the 5th Gebirgsjäger Division at Maleme. Fresh troops with mortars, machine guns, and artillery are reinforcing the exhausted paratroopers. Freyberg and his staff recognize that Maleme is the critical point, but they're uncertain about the overall situation. Reports from Heraklion and Rethymno indicate that German attacks there have been repulsed. Intelligence suggests more German forces might be coming by sea. Freyberg is reluctant to commit his reserves entirely to Maleme when he believes other threats might materialize. A coordinated Allied counterattack might still recapture Maleme on May 21st or 22nd. But confusion, communication problems, and Freyberg's belief that seaborne invasion is still the primary threat prevent such an attack from being organized. Instead, the Germans continue landing reinforcements at Maleme. The stream of Ju-52s becomes a river. Student commits every available aircraft, accepting heavy losses. Over 220 transport aircraft will be destroyed or damaged during the battle, to pour troops onto Crete faster than the Allies can contain them. The airfield was a graveyard of wrecked aircraft, recalled a German mountain trooper who arrived on May 22nd. They were everywhere, crashed, burned, shot up, but more kept coming. We'd jump out, grab our weapons and run off the runway while the next plane was already approaching. It was organized chaos, but somehow it worked. By May 23rd, the Germans have over 7,000 men ashore at Maleme, including artillery and light armor. They begin pushing eastward along the coast road toward Kanea and the Allied headquarters. The New Zealand and British defenders fight skillfully and courageously. But they're being overwhelmed by numbers and by Luftwaffe attacks that pound defensive positions relentlessly. The loss of Hill 107, the result of one captain's decision made in darkness and confusion, has cascaded into the loss of Maleme Airfield, which is cascading into the loss of the entire western part of Crete. The German reinforcement rate is now faster than Allied attempts to contain them. What had seemed like an Allied victory on May 20th has become, within 48 hours, an Allied disaster. The battle for Maleme, and with it the Battle of Crete, has been decided. When farmers became warriors. While professional soldiers battled for control of the airfields, another extraordinary drama was unfolding across Crete: the spontaneous rising of the civilian population against the German invaders. The Cretans are not ordinary civilians. They're fiercely independent, proud of their warrior tradition dating back to ancient times, and deeply protective of their island. When German paratroopers began landing in their olive groves and village squares, many Cretans didn't wait for orders or permission. They grabbed whatever weapons they could find and attacked. Farm tools became weapons of war. Men armed with axes, scythes, and hunting rifles stalked German paratroopers who had become separated from their units. Women and even children participated, throwing stones, guiding Allied soldiers to German positions, or caring for wounded defenders. We saw old men with ancient rifles, shepherds with their crooks, farmers with knives, recalled a German paratrooper. They would appear from behind walls or out of olive groves and attack us. Some of our men were killed by people we hadn't even considered combatants. It was terrifying because you couldn't tell who was a threat and who wasn't. In some villages, the entire population took up arms. When German paratroopers landed near the village of Codenamed, local people joined with Allied soldiers to attack them. They killed or captured many of the Germans, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to ambush isolated soldiers. Georgos Petrakis, a resistance leader who would later be known as Petrako Georgis, organized guerrilla attacks against German positions. At the Battle of Trahili, Petrakis and his fighters, including local villagers, ambushed a German column and inflicted casualties before escaping into the mountains. Cretan women showed remarkable courage. They sheltered wounded Allied soldiers, guided them through mountain paths to evacuation points, and carried messages between isolated defensive positions. Some directly participated in combat, shooting at German paratroopers or throwing grenades scavenged from battlefields. I remember an old woman who came up to our position carrying a basket, recalled a New Zealand soldier. We thought she was bringing us food. Instead, she opened the basket and it was full of German weapons and ammunition she'd collected from dead paratroopers. She dumped it at our feet, nodded, and walked away without saying a word. That was the spirit of the Cretans. The civilian resistance had a real military impact. German paratroopers who should have been organizing attacks or locating their weapon containers instead had to watch for threats from unexpected quarters. Units became hesitant to advance through villages where they might be ambushed by the local population. The psychological effect of knowing that even unarmed-looking civilians might be enemies created constant tension. But this resistance would come at a terrible price. The Germans, frustrated by what they considered illegal civilian warfare, responded with brutal reprisals. Villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters or attacking German soldiers were destroyed. Men of military age were rounded up and executed. In some cases, entire communities were massacred as examples to others. At Codenamed on June 2nd, German paratroopers rounded up male civilians and executed 23 of them in retaliation for the village's resistance. Similar atrocities occurred across the island. Condanos, Floria, Skeens, and dozens of other villages were destroyed. Buildings burned, residents killed or driven out. A German sign erected at Condanos read, "In retribution for the bestial murder of paratroopers and engineers, Condanos was completely destroyed and will never be rebuilt." By the time the battle ended, over 100 Cretan villages had been destroyed and hundreds of civilians had been executed. The resistance had been brave and effective, but it had brought down terrible German vengeance on the civilian population. Years later, German veterans and Cretan survivors would sometimes meet to discuss the battle. The Germans would express regret for the reprisals while maintaining that civilian attacks had violated the laws of war. The Cretans would respond that defending their homeland against invasion was not only their right but their duty, and that the true violation was the German invasion itself. The Cretan resistance would continue throughout the German occupation of the island, which lasted until 1945. Guerrilla fighters harassed German garrisons, aided Allied intelligence agents, and kept the spirit of resistance alive. In 1944, Cretan partisans working with British SOE agents kidnapped German General Heinrich Kreipe, a daring operation that became legendary and was later depicted in the film Ill Met by Moonlight. The civilian resistance on Crete demonstrated that modern warfare could not be neatly contained between uniformed armies, that when a population was determined to resist, every village became a potential battlefield, and every citizen a potential combatant. It was a lesson that would be repeated in occupied territories across Europe and would influence both German occupation policies and Allied support for resistance movements. The Navy's sacrifice. While the battle raged on land, the Royal Navy was fighting its own desperate campaign in the waters around Crete. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, had orders to prevent German seaborne reinforcements from reaching the island at all costs. On the night of May 21st to 22nd, British destroyers and cruisers intercepted a German invasion flotilla, a collection of small boats carrying mountain troops and supplies. The British ships tore into the convoy, sinking most of the vessels and killing hundreds of German soldiers. It was a complete victory, but it came with a terrible price. The ships had to operate within range of German air bases on the Greek mainland and on Crete itself. As dawn broke on May 22nd, the Luftwaffe found the British ships. Wave after wave of Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and Ju-88 bombers attacked the vessels. The destroyers Greyhound and Kashmir were sunk. The cruiser Gloucester was crippled and then sunk with heavy loss of life. The destroyer Kelly, commanded by Lord Louis Mountbatten, was hit and capsized. The pilots of the Luftwaffe were hunting the Royal Navy with systematic fury. Every British ship operating north of Crete was a target. The Navy had almost no air cover. The RAF had evacuated their aircraft from Crete before the invasion, leaving the ships defensively exposed. On May 23rd, the battleships Warspite and Valiant, along with cruisers and destroyers, conducted a sweep north of Crete. They came under sustained air attack for hours. Warspite was hit by a 1,000-pound bomb that penetrated her decks and killed 38 men. Both battleships were damaged and had to withdraw to Alexandria for repairs. Admiral Cunningham faced an agonizing decision. His ships were being destroyed, his sailors were dying, and he still hadn't stopped all German reinforcements. The Luftwaffe's dominance of the air meant that operating near Crete in daylight was becoming suicidal, but abandoning the area would allow the Germans to pour in reinforcements by sea. "The Navy must not let the Army down," Cunningham declared. "It takes 3 years to build a ship, but 300 years to build a tradition. We will continue operations." The ships went back, On May 26th, the destroyers Imperial and Hereward were lost. The cruiser Dido was severely damaged. On May 27th, destroyers Decoy and Hero were damaged. The casualties mounted day after day. Not just ships, but men, hundreds of sailors killed by bombs and machine gun fire from aircraft they couldn't effectively shoot down. By the time the battle ended, the Royal Navy had lost 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers sunk, with 2 battleships, 1 aircraft carrier, 6 cruisers, and 7 destroyers damaged. Over 2,000 sailors had been killed, more than the British Army lost on land during the battle. The Navy paid a terrible price at Crete, reflected a British naval historian. They fought against an enemy they couldn't reach, aircraft operating from bases beyond their guns' range. They demonstrated extraordinary courage, but courage alone couldn't overcome the tactical reality that ships without air cover were sitting targets for modern dive bombers. The Battle of Crete demonstrated a fundamental shift in naval warfare. For centuries, ships had been the dominant military power. Mobile platforms that could project force against land targets while remaining relatively safe from shore-based threats. But the airplane had changed everything. Ships without air superiority were vulnerable in a way they had never been before. This lesson would influence Allied planning for the rest of the war. The emphasis on aircraft carriers in the Pacific, the development of shipborne radar and anti-aircraft systems, the creation of specialized anti-aircraft cruisers, and the doctrine of integrated air-sea operations. All of these developments were shaped by the hard lessons learned in the waters around Crete. But for the sailors who fought there, these future developments were cold comfort. They had been asked to fight a battle they couldn't win, and they had paid the price in blood and steel. The bitter evacuation. By May 26th, General Freyberg recognized that the battle was lost. The Germans controlled Maleme and were advancing eastward along the coast. Allied forces were running low on ammunition, food, and water. The Luftwaffe bombed defensive positions relentlessly. Reinforcement or resupply was impossible. The Royal Navy couldn't operate safely near Crete in daylight, and nighttime operations couldn't deliver enough supplies to make a difference. Freyberg requested permission to evacuate. Churchill, thousands of miles away in London, reluctantly agreed. The evacuation would be carried out from the small port of Sfakia on the south coast, where ships could approach under cover of darkness and be gone before the Luftwaffe could attack at dawn. The retreat to Sfakia became an epic of endurance. Allied troops, British, Australian, New Zealand, and Greek, fell back through the mountains, fighting rearguard actions to delay the German pursuit. They abandoned their heavy equipment, destroyed what couldn't be carried, and made their way along narrow mountain paths toward the evacuation point. "It was a nightmare," recalled an Australian soldier. "We'd been fighting for days with almost no sleep, little food, and constant air attacks. Now we had to march over mountains in the heat, always looking over our shoulders, for German pursuit men were collapsing from exhaustion. Some just sat down by the side of the path and said they couldn't go on." The path to Sfakia led through rugged terrain with few roads. Wounded men had to be carried. Supply vehicles that broke down were pushed off cliffs to prevent the Germans from using them. Every few hours, units would stop to fight rearguard actions against pursuing German forces, buying time for the main body to continue the retreat. At Sfakia, the Royal Navy performed one of its finest operations of the war. Despite the losses already suffered, despite the danger of operating near Crete, the ships came back night after night from May 28th to June 1st. Destroyers and cruisers approached the coast, took aboard as many men as they could carry, and raced south before dawn to escape the Luftwaffe. The scene at the beach was heartbreaking. Thousands of men waited in the darkness for ships that might not come. Officers selected who would be evacuated each night. The wounded first, then units in rotation. Men not selected waited another day, hoping they would be chosen before the Germans arrived. You'd see the ships approaching in the darkness and everyone would surge toward the beach, one soldier recalled. But there was only room for so many. You'd watch your mates get on the boats and you'd wonder if you'd ever see them again, or if you'd be captured before the next night's evacuation. On the night of May 31st to June 1st, the last evacuation ships arrived. About 4,000 men were still waiting on the beach, too many to take. The ship commanders made the agonizing decision to leave them behind. At 3 a.m. on June 1st, the last destroyer pulled away from Slovakia, packed with soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder on every deck. On the beach, the 4,000 men who remained destroyed their weapons and prepared to surrender. Many were furious. They had fought bravely, had survived the retreat, and now were being abandoned. But the simple mathematics of shipping meant there weren't enough boats and not enough hours of darkness to take everyone. In total, the Royal Navy evacuated about 18,000 Allied troops from Crete. A remarkable achievement given the circumstances, but still less than half of the approximately 42,000 who had been on the island. About 12,000 Allied soldiers were captured and approximately 1,700 were killed. The Greek forces, which had fought alongside the Commonwealth troops throughout the battle, were largely left behind. Without the means to evacuate and unwilling to leave their homeland, many Greek soldiers melted into the civilian population or joined the resistance that would continue fighting the German occupation. On June 1, 1941, the Battle of Crete officially ended. The Germans had won, but at a cost that shocked Hitler and the German High Command. The Pyrrhic victory. The Germans had captured Crete, but they had paid a terrible price. Approximately 4,000 German soldiers, mostly elite paratroopers, had been killed, with another 2,000 wounded. Over 220 transport aircraft had been destroyed or damaged. Irreplaceable losses that severely impacted German airlift capability for the rest of the war. For the Fallschirmjäger, the proud paratroopers who had been the spearhead of the invasion, the Battle of Crete was a devastating experience. These men had been the elite of the Wehrmacht, volunteers who underwent rigorous training and who considered themselves the vanguard of a new form of warfare. They had jumped into Crete expecting to overwhelm the defenders quickly. Instead, they had been massacred. "We lost the flower of German youth on Crete," one paratrooper officer wrote later. "The best men, the bravest, the most dedicated, they died in the first hours of the battle, shot from the sky or killed on landing. Those of us who survived were changed. We had learned that courage alone wasn't enough, that even elite troops could be destroyed by determined defenders." Kurt Student visited Crete after the battle and was shaken by what he saw. The cemeteries filled with his men, the burned-out aircraft, the stories of units that had been wiped out almost to the last man. All of it weighed heavily on him. He had advocated for this operation, had convinced Hitler that airborne assault could work, and now thousands of his men were dead. When Student reported to Hitler on the outcome of Operation Mercury, the Führer's response was blunt. "The day of the paratrooper is over. The parachute arm is a surprise weapon, and the surprise has been used up. There will be no more large-scale airborne operations." Hitler's decision was based on cold military logic. The losses on Crete couldn't be quickly replaced. Training elite paratroopers took time and resources. The element of surprise, critical to airborne operations, had been lost. Future enemies would be prepared for airborne assault, would have developed tactics and defenses specifically designed to counter it. For the remainder of the war, German paratroopers would fight as elite infantry rather than as airborne assault troops. They would see action in North Africa, Italy, Russia, and Normandy, and they would continue to demonstrate exceptional combat effectiveness. But they would rarely jump from aircraft again. The revolutionary form of warfare that Student had pioneered died on the beaches and airfields of Crete. Ironically, the Allies drew exactly the opposite conclusion from the battle, They saw that despite heavy casualties, the German airborne assault had succeeded. They recognized that if it could work in the face of determined defenders who had advance warning, it could definitely work under more favorable conditions. The United States and Britain began massive expansions of their airborne forces. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were formed in the U.S. The British expanded their airborne capabilities significantly. By 1944, the Allies had tens of thousands of trained paratroopers ready for deployment. These forces would prove their value in North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and the Rhine crossings. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, began with massive airborne drops, British and American paratroopers seizing key objectives behind the beaches, disrupting German communications and preventing reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches. The operation Student had pioneered at Crete. The Allies perfected at Normandy. The Germans taught us how to use airborne forces at Crete, then abandoned the tactic just as we were learning to perfect it, observed an American airborne commander. It was one of the great strategic mistakes of the war. If Hitler had continued to develop German airborne capabilities instead of abandoning them, D-Day would have been much more difficult, perhaps impossible. The unsung heroes. While the famous names, Student, Freiburg, Cunningham, dominated the historical accounts of the Battle of Crete, thousands of lesser-known individuals displayed extraordinary heroism that deserves recognition. Lieutenant Colonel Reginald Judson, a New Zealand officer, led defensive actions that held off German attacks against overwhelming odds. His leadership under fire saved countless lives, but his name rarely appears in general histories of the battle. The Cretan civilians who participated in the resistance showed courage that went largely unrecorded. Men like Conios, who stood waist-deep in the sea at night helping evacuate British soldiers and intelligence agents, women who sheltered wounded Allied soldiers at risk of their own lives. Children who served as runners carrying messages between isolated units. The British SOE agents, Tom Dunbaben, Sandy Rendell, and later Paddy Lee Fermor, who stayed on Crete after the German victory and organized the resistance movement. These men lived in the mountains, coordinated guerrilla operations, and kept the spirit of resistance alive throughout the occupation. Lee Fermor would later lead the audacious operation to kidnap German General Kreipe, an act of defiance that showed the occupiers they were never truly safe. On the German side, Major Edgar Stenzler and Major Otto Scherber led their paratrooper battalions with courage and skill despite facing impossible odds. These officers saw most of their men killed in the first hours of battle, yet they continued to fight and accomplish their objectives through sheer determination. The Royal Navy sailors who died in the waters around Crete deserve special recognition. Over 2,000 men were killed serving aboard ships that came under relentless air attack. These men couldn't shoot back at the aircraft attacking them. They could only endure the bombing and strafing while trying to accomplish their mission. Their sacrifice prevented even greater German reinforcements from reaching Crete and saved thousands of Allied soldiers during the evacuation. The Greek forces, often overlooked in English-language accounts, fought with determination throughout the battle. Greek infantry battalions held key positions. Greek anti-aircraft gunners shot down German transport aircraft, and Greek civilians participated in the resistance. When the battle ended, Greek soldiers melted into the population and continued fighting as guerrillas. The medical personnel on both sides worked under impossible conditions. Doctors and nurses operated makeshift field hospitals under constant bombardment, treating wounded men with limited supplies and no hope of evacuation. Many medical staff members were killed or wounded while trying to save others. The true heroes of Crete were the ordinary soldiers who did their duty under extraordinary circumstances, reflected one historian. The privates and corporates who held their positions despite being outnumbered, the sailors who stayed at their guns while bombs fell around them, the civilians who chose to resist despite knowing the consequences. These people, whose names we'll never know, are the ones who truly define the battle. The cost to the Cretan population was particularly severe and is often underrepresented in military histories. Over 100 villages were destroyed during and after the battle. Hundreds of civilians were executed in reprisals. The German occupation would last until 1945, and the island would suffer continued hardship, resistance, and repression throughout those years. Lessons written in blood. The Battle of Crete taught lessons that would shape military doctrine for decades to come. These lessons were purchased at a terrible price, in German, Allied, and civilian blood, but they fundamentally changed how modern warfare would be conducted. The importance of air superiority. Crete demonstrated that control of the air could decide the outcome of battles on land and sea. The Germans succeeded despite heavy casualties because the Luftwaffe controlled the skies. The Royal Navy suffered devastating losses because ships without air cover were vulnerable to air attack. The Allied ground forces fought skillfully but couldn't overcome the constant bombing and strafing. Future Allied operations would emphasize air superiority above almost all other considerations. The massive investment in fighters, bombers, and aircraft carriers, the development of close air support doctrine, the coordination between air and ground forces, all of these flowed from the lessons of Crete. The value and vulnerability of airborne forces. The battle proved that airborne assault could achieve strategic objectives that conventional forces couldn't reach quickly. But it also demonstrated that paratroopers were extremely vulnerable during descent and landing, and that success required overwhelming force, perfect timing, and willingness to accept heavy casualties. The Allies would apply these lessons in their own airborne operations. At Normandy, they would drop paratroopers at night to reduce vulnerability during descent. They would provide extensive air support to suppress defenses. They would accept that casualties would be high, but manage them through better planning and overwhelming force. The critical importance of intelligence and command. The Allies had perfect intelligence about German plans but failed to use it effectively because of command assumptions that contradicted what the intelligence was saying. This demonstrated that collecting information wasn't enough. Commanders had to be willing to believe it and act on it. Future operations would see better integration of intelligence into operational planning. The creation of specialized intelligence officers at field headquarters, improved communication between intelligence services and commanders, and the willingness to act on intelligence even when it contradicted assumptions. All of these improvements came from lessons learned at Crete. The role of civilians in modern warfare. The Cretan civilian resistance showed that modern total war couldn't be neatly confined to uniformed combatants. When populations were willing to resist, every village became a potential battlefield. This had implications for occupation policy, for resistance movements, and for the increasingly blurred line between combatants and civilians in modern conflict. The Germans would face partisan resistance across occupied Europe, requiring hundreds of thousands of troops for rear area security that could otherwise have been used at the front. The Allies would support resistance movements with supplies, training, and coordination, recognizing that local resistance could tie down enemy forces and provide valuable intelligence. The limitations of seaborne assault without air cover. The Royal Navy's losses around Crete demonstrated that amphibious operations without control of the air were extremely dangerous. This would influence planning for future operations, particularly the Normandy invasion, where the Allies would ensure overwhelming air superiority before attempting the amphibious assault. Crete was a laboratory where new forms of warfare were tested, observed military historian Anthony Beaver. The lessons learned there, some by the Germans, others by the Allies, would influence operations for the rest of the war and beyond. In that sense, the battle's significance extends far beyond the 12 days of fighting on one Mediterranean island. The Long Shadow. The Battle of Crete cast a long shadow over the remainder of World War II and beyond. For the Germans, it marked the beginning of the end of their offensive momentum. The casualties suffered on Crete, combined with the decision to abandon large-scale airborne operations, removed a weapon from their arsenal at exactly the moment when they needed to be innovating new tactics. Just 3 weeks after Crete fell, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The paratroopers, who might have been used to seize key bridges and objectives in Russia, were instead recovering from wounds or lying in graves on Crete. The transport aircraft that could have supplied German spearheads deep in Soviet territory had been destroyed over Maleme. The momentum and confidence that had carried the Wehrmacht from victory to victory had been shaken by the near disaster on Crete. For the Allies, Crete was another in a long string of defeats and evacuations: Norway, France, Greece, Crete. The morale impact was significant. British prestige had been damaged by the repeated retreats. Questions were being asked about British leadership and whether the Empire could stand against German military superiority. But beneath the surface, the Allies were learning. They were studying what worked and what didn't. They were building forces, developing doctrine, and preparing for the day when they would take the offensive. The lessons of Crete would be applied at El Alamein, at Sicily, at Normandy, and in dozens of other battles. For the people of Crete, the battle was the beginning of 4 years of occupation, resistance, and suffering. The German reprisals during and after the battle created a legacy of hatred that would fuel resistance throughout the war. Cretan partisans would continue to fight, supported by British SOE agents, disrupting German operations and reminding the occupiers that they ruled through force, not consent. The battle also raised uncomfortable moral questions that remain relevant today. Was the Cretan civilian resistance heroic defense of homeland or illegal warfare? Were the German reprisals war crimes or legitimate responses to civilian attacks? How does international law balance the right of populations to resist invasion against the military necessity of maintaining order in occupied territory? There are no clean answers to these questions, reflected historian Mark Mazauer. The Germans invaded Crete without justification, making Cretan resistance morally legitimate. But the Germans believed they were fighting according to the laws of war, which prohibited civilian combatants. The result was tragedy. Civilians killed for defending their homes, soldiers killed by non-uniformed combatants. It's the ugly reality of total war. Remembrance and legacy. Today, memorials on Crete mark the sites where the battle was fought. At Maleme, a German military cemetery holds the graves of thousands of paratroopers who died in the invasion. At Ceuta Bay, a Commonwealth war graves cemetery commemorates the Allied dead. Throughout the island, smaller memorials mark where specific units fought or where civilians were executed. The Palace of Justice building in Canea, where General Freiberg had his headquarters, still stands. The airfields that were fought over so desperately are still in use, though now they serve commercial aviation and NATO operations rather than military conquest. Crete's role in World War II has become central to the island's identity. The resistance against the German invasion is remembered with pride, celebrated in local ceremonies and taught in schools. The civilian participation in the battle has become part of Cretan national mythology, a testament to the fierce independence and courage that Cretans see as defining characteristics of their culture. For military historians and strategists, Crete remains a fascinating case study. It's examined in staff colleges and military academies as an example of airborne warfare, of intelligence failures, of the importance of air power, and of the role of civilians in modern conflict. The battle has been the subject of dozens of books, academic studies, and documentaries. Survivors, both Allied and German, published memoirs that provided first-hand accounts of the fighting. Some Allied and German veterans even returned to Crete years later to visit the battlefields and to meet their former enemies in a spirit of reconciliation. "I returned to Crete in the 1970s, recalled a German paratrooper veteran. "I was afraid of how the Cretans would receive me. After all, I had been part of the invasion force and I knew what had happened to their villages, but they welcomed me. They showed me where my unit had fought, they shared their memories, and they treated me not as an enemy but as someone who shared the experience of that terrible battle. It was healing for both of us. The last survivors of the Battle of Crete are gone now, joining their comrades who fell in May 1941. But their story remains, a testament to courage on all sides, to the brutality of modern war, to the power of resistance, and to the cost of innovation in warfare. The Battle of Crete was the first major airborne invasion, but it was far from the last. The tactics pioneered there, for better and worse, would be used in conflicts around the world for decades to come. Every time paratroopers jump into combat, every time air superiority is emphasized in operational planning, every time civilians resist occupation, the shadow of Crete is there. The final reckoning. This has been WW2 Stories. I'm Philip Champion. As we remember the Battle of Crete, let us honor the courage displayed on all sides, the German paratroopers who jumped into the face of overwhelming fire, knowing that many would die before reaching the ground. The Allied soldiers who fought against impossible odds with skill and determination. The Royal Navy sailors who sailed into danger again and again to support the defense and evacuate the survivors. And especially the Cretan civilians who rose up spontaneously to defend their island, knowing they would face terrible consequences. The Battle of Crete was a turning point in military history. It demonstrated that the airplane had fundamentally changed warfare, that control of the air could determine the outcome of battles on land and sea, and that new technologies demanded new tactics and strategies. The Germans proved that large-scale airborne invasion was possible, then abandoned the tactic after the terrible casualties they suffered. The Allies learned from German success and German mistakes and went on to use airborne forces effectively for the remainder of the war. But beyond the tactical and strategic lessons, Crete reminds us of the human cost of war. The 4,000 German soldiers who died, most of them elite paratroopers in their 20s, represented not just military casualties but young men with families, dreams, and futures that were cut short. The 1,700 Allied soldiers killed, the 2,000 Royal Navy sailors lost, the hundreds of Cretan civilians executed. Each death was a tragedy that rippled outward through families and communities. The Battle of Crete also reminds us that intelligence without wisdom, information without understanding, knowledge without proper action, are all worthless. The Allies knew the invasion was coming, knew the method, knew the objectives, and still lost because commanders didn't fully trust or properly act on that information. It's a lesson relevant far beyond military operations, a reminder that having facts is not enough. We must also have the wisdom to properly interpret and act on them. The courage of the Cretan civilians, farmers and shepherds and shopkeepers who picked up whatever weapons they could find and attacked trained soldiers stands as a testament to the human spirit's refusal to accept domination. But it also reminds us of the terrible price that resistance can exact, not just on the resistors but on their entire communities. The 100 villages destroyed, the hundreds of civilians executed, the years of harsh occupation. These were the consequences of defiance. Was that defiance worth it? The Cretans themselves answer yes without hesitation. They believe, and I think rightly, that there are things worth fighting for even when the odds are overwhelming, even when the price is terrible. Freedom is one of those things. The right to defend one's homeland is one of those things. The refusal to submit to tyranny is one of those things. The Battle of Crete was fought over 75 years ago, but its lessons remain relevant. As we face new forms of warfare, new technologies, new threats, we would do well to remember what happened on that Mediterranean island in May 1941. Remember that courage alone is not enough without proper planning and preparation. Remember that technology changes the nature of conflict in fundamental ways that require new thinking, not old assumptions. Remember that civilians become part of war whether we want them to or not. And remember that the choices made by commanders in moments of confusion and stress can have consequences that echo through the decades. The sky over Crete is peaceful now. The airfields that were fought over so desperately serve commercial flights carrying tourists to the island's beaches. The olive groves where paratroopers died have long since recovered. The villages that were destroyed have been rebuilt. But the memory remains, preserved in memorials and military studies, in the stories passed down through generations. The men who fought at Crete, German, British, Australian, New Zealand, Greek, and Cretan, are nearly all gone now. But their battle remains, a stark reminder of war's costs and its lessons, of human courage and human cruelty, of innovation and tradition, of victory and defeat. May we remember them, may we learn from them, and may we strive to ensure that the lessons purchased with their blood are not forgotten.